Reformed thinking, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we have a really big task ahead of us. We're tackling a stack of source material that cuts straight to the root of, our whole moral experience as human beings. We aren't really getting into what is right or wrong today, but something much more fundamental. Where does the whole idea of right and wrong even come from?
That's right. Our listeners sent in sources that draw heavily on C.S. Lewis's work, specifically his very clear, very accessible discussion on what he calls the moral law. He's really focused on setting a foundation here. You have to remember, Lewis in his day was dealing with a world that was pretty confident that this whole concept of a natural law, of a real right and wrong, could be easily explained away.
And it seems like not much has changed. So our mission today is really to solidify that foundation for you, the listener. We're going to do a deep dive into two of the classic objections that, honestly, if they hold up, they kind of dismantle any claim to an objective morality. The first one is that morality is nothing but a biological instinct.
And the second is that it's just a social convention that changes over time.
So we need to see how Lewis just systematically, with pure logic, takes both of these arguments apart.
And this isn't just some academic exercise.
Yeah.
Getting a handle on why the moral law can't be boiled down to biology or just arbitrary social rules.
Yeah.
It's the prerequisite for any meaningful conversation about human nature, about accountability, and about whether there's a standard that stands over all of us. If Lewis's arguments hold, it changes the entire ethical playing field for you.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that first and probably most common objection. A lot of people today will suggest that what we call the moral law, this rule of decent behavior, is really just a sophisticated form of herd instinct. It's just a biological drive that developed to help the species survive, like a mother's love for her child or the instinct to find food. It's evolution making rules so the group can stick together.
It's a very compelling claim in our modern world, isn't it? Because it seems to anchor morality in something real, something tangible.
Yeah.
Our biology. And Lewis is quick to acknowledge that, yes, of course we have instincts. We have desires that push us to help other people. But he immediately draws this razor-sharp distinction between the internal push, the want that we feel, and what he calls the external command, the ought that we recognize.
That's really the whole crux of it, isn't it? The difference between want and ought.
It is.
If the moral law is just another instinct, it would always speak the language of desire. It would say, I want to help. But if it's something different, something else, it speaks the language of obligation. It says, I ought to help even if I don't want to.
Precisely. And to make this crystal clear, let's use Lewis's classic scenario.
Yeah.
It illustrates this crucial difference perfectly.
The drowning man.
The drowning man. So imagine you're there. You witness a truly dangerous situation. You see someone struggling in rough water, and it's clear they are drowning. Inside you, in that very instant, two very powerful, very conflicting instincts just erupt.
The first would be that impulse to help, right? What we call the herd instinct or sympathy. You feel a pull to jump in.
Yes. But the second one, and let's be honest, it's often much, much stronger, is the instinct for self-preservation. It's that powerful, primal desire to stay safe, to not get yourself killed.
So you have two voices screaming at you at the same time, help! And run.
Exactly. Just two competing forces, two distinct desires, pulling you in opposite directions. Now, if morality were only instinct, the story would end right there.
Meaning the stronger one would just win out.
It would have to. You'd feel the stronger pull and you'd do that thing. If self-preservation won, maybe you'd walk away feeling a bit uncomfortable, but you wouldn't feel a deep sense of moral failure. It would just be biology doing its thing.
But Lewis says that's not our actual experience. He says there's a third thing present in that moment.
There is absolutely a third thing. And that third thing is this awareness, this feeling that you should suppress the impulse to run away, even if that desire to run is overwhelmingly strong. And that you should follow the impulse to help, even if the idea of helping is terrifying. This third thing is the judge. It sits above the instincts. It's not one of them, it's the director.
That's the logical step then. The thing that is judging two other things, telling you which one to listen to and which one to ignore, it can't logically be one of the things it's judging.
It's structurally impossible for it to be. And the analogy Lewis gives here is just. It's perfect. The piano and the sheet music, our biological instincts, self-preservation, herd instinct, hunger, the sexual drive, all of them. Those are the keys on the piano. They're just the raw material. They're the mechanisms that let us act.
But the moral law, that's the sheet music. It's the instruction manual.
Yes. The sheet music tells you when to play a specific key, how hard you should hit it, and when you should just leave it alone entirely. The sheet music itself is not made of ivory and wood. It's not one of the keys.
So if the sheet music says, play a C sharp, and the C sharp key itself pipes up and says, wait a minute, I am the sheet music, the whole system just collapses into nonsense.
It's a category error. The law, the instruction, is external to the biological mechanism, the instinct that it's commanding. The tune we're supposed to play, which is good conduct, is created by the law directing the keys at just the right moment. The very existence of that judging faculty inside you proves the moral law is something separate from the raw material of your desires.
Okay, so that brings us to a second really critical point that Lewis makes about the strength of these impulses. If morality were simply the stronger instinct winning out, the outcome would just be a matter of biological intensity. But what we find is that the moral law often tells us to do the exact opposite.
This is an incredibly persuasive point because it uses our own inner experience against that deterministic biological view.
How so?
Well, think about physics. If two physical forces collide, the stronger one wins. Period. End of story. So if the instinct for your own safety is biologically stronger than the instinct to help a complete stranger,
Then safety has to win every time.
it must win. And what we call morality would just be the story we tell ourselves afterwards to justify why the strongest impulse won.
But our conscience doesn't work like that. It tells us we have to help the drowning person, even though, if we're being really honest with ourselves, our raw physical or emotional want for our own safety is probably overwhelming in that moment.
You're likely to desire your own safety far, far more strongly than you desire to help that stranger. And that's the absolute contradiction for the instinct theory. The moral law consistently commands us to obey what Lewis calls the weaker impulse. It requires self-sacrifice. It requires the suppression of our primal self-interest.
Now, someone might argue, well, maybe over millions of years, the herd instinct has actually become the dominant one because communal survival helps individual survival. So maybe the stronger long-term instinct is the one that wins out.
And that's the more sophisticated evolutionary challenge. You're right. But Lewis's logic still holds up because the moral law isn't acting like a statistician, averaging out what's best for the group over the next 1,000 years.
No, it's immediate.
It's an immediate commander making a singular binding demand in a moment of peril. In that instant, when those two instincts are really colliding head-on, the moral law sides with the one that feels weaker, less urgent, and frankly, more dangerous to you personally.
So it can't be the sum of our instincts or even the average of them. It has to be an independent rule, some kind of standard that we use to weigh the competing instincts against each other.
Yes, if it were just the sum, it would reflect the loudest voice in the room, the most dominant feeling. It would be the loudest note on the piano. But instead, it's that quiet external voice that says, look, despite your fear, despite the intensity of your survival impulse, the rule here requires this specific, difficult action. And that shows that the moral law is prescriptive. It prescribes behavior based on a rule, not descriptive, which would just describe whatever action came from the strongest biological drive. It gives us a little glimpse of something that's outside the biological system entirely.
So let's look at a third way Lewis pulls the law and instinct apart. This one focuses on those times when we feel a moral duty to kind of manufacture a feeling that we don't actually have. I mean, if the moral law was really just an instinct, why would we ever feel like we have a duty to strengthen it?
This really gets at what you might call the coldness of duty. There's so many times when we know what we ought to do, but we check our emotional gas tank and it's empty. Our pity, our compassion, our willingness to help. It's just not there. And yet, we feel this internal mandate. You need to wake up your herd instinct. You need to get it going.
We have to actively generate the emotional steam, as Lewis calls it, just to get ourselves to do the right thing. I feel this sometimes when I have to deal with, say, a difficult neighbor or a frustrating family situation. My natural goodwill is just gone. But I know I should feel pity or patience, so I have to almost force myself to conjure it up.
And that intentional act of conjuring is the key piece of evidence. How can the thing that needs to be awakened be the very same thing that's giving the command to wake up?
It can't be.
The command is the moral law. The thing being commanded is the instinct. The sheet music can tell the pianist, you need more volume on this part, but the sheet music is not the volume knob. The two are separate.
So if I feel an obligation to really focus my mind on what a suffering person is going through, specifically so I can generate a feeling of pity that isn't there naturally, that proves the obligation itself came from a standard that's higher than my current dormant feeling of pity.
It shows the legislative quality of the moral law. It's like a lawgiver. It isn't satisfied with the strength of the instinct as it finds it. It demands a level of emotional input, a level of action that goes beyond our current natural state. This separates the moral law not just from our strong instincts, but also from our weak ones, and it really demonstrates its supervisory role over the whole array of our internal drives.
Right, because if morality were just biological, we'd just do whatever action corresponds to the feelings we happen to have at the moment.
And we wouldn't feel bad about it. The fact that we feel guilty for not having the right feelings and then feel duty-bound to try and cultivate them demonstrates the independence of the law from the feelings it governs.
Okay, this leads right into a common misunderstanding that comes out of the instinct theory. And that's the idea that some of our impulses are just inherently good, like mother love or patriotism, and others are inherently bad, like sex or aggression. If the moral law were just an instinct, we should be able to point to one of them that is always, in every single situation, the right one to follow.
And Lewis basically challenges anyone to find such an instinct. He says, very firmly, that it just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
He reclassifies all our impulses as being fundamentally neutral. They're just tools. They're the piano keys. No single key on a piano is inherently a wrong note. Every note is correct at one time and incorrect at another. It all depends on the tune that the sheet music is calling for.
Can you walk us through that with an impulse that seems purely good, like a mother's love for her child? How can that become morally wrong if it's not directed by something else?
Of course, take mother love. In its proper place, it's a beautiful, powerful thing. But if a mother elevates her fierce devotion to her own child above the rule of justice, her love becomes destructive.
For example,
If she lies to protect her child from consequences he deserves, or if she, say, steals resources meant for other children just to benefit her own, then her impulse, no matter how strong or pure it felt to her, is now directing her toward injustice. The moral law is what commands her to suppress that fierce protective instinct in favor of fairness to everyone.
and on the flip side, those impulses that society often labels as bad or dangerous, the fighting instinct, for instance, are sometimes the very thing the moral law commands us to use.
Absolutely. The fighting instinct, you could call it aggression or righteous anger, is clearly required when you have to defend someone who's vulnerable. If a soldier is called to defend their people from an invader, or a person has to defend a victim from an assault, the moral law actually commands them to encourage and use that instinct. The point is, the impulse itself has no intrinsic moral value. The moral value is only in the instruction that commands the impulse at the right time and in the right measure.
So the moral law isn't just a list of our instincts. It's more like the master carpenter who knows how to arrange all the different tools. And if you take any single tool and make it the master, the whole project, your life, your conduct, is going to end up crooked and dangerous.
That is the big practical consequence Lewis warns about, the danger of absolutizing any single impulse. If you pick one internal drive, even one that seems as noble as, say, compassion for the suffering, and you set it up as the one thing to follow at all costs, you very quickly find yourself having to negate other virtues, like truth and justice.
I think we should pause on this because it's so relevant to modern conversations. If a person decides that love of humanity is their ultimate moral guide, they might start to justify some truly terrible actions.
The outcomes are often terrifying. If the overall benefit of humanity is your absolute goal and you leave out the need for justice or truthfulness, which are also directed by the moral law, you can start to rationalize things.
Like what?
Like breaking sworn agreements with a minority group, or manipulating public opinion with lies, or even fabricating evidence in trials, all under the banner of serving some greater benevolent cause. By following that one impulse absolutely, you become treacherous and cruel in the pursuit of what you thought was good.
And that just proves again that the moral law has to be this balanced director external to all our internal motivations and supervising them.
It does. It firmly establishes the conclusion for this first part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
The moral law is not a description of our biological urges. It's a prescriptive standard that governs them. We've successfully disconnected the ought from the want.
Okay, so if the moral law isn't rooted in our biology, the next most obvious objection immediately comes up. It must just be a social convention. It's just something we're taught. It's passed down through education from our parents, from our society. Therefore, it's something humans invented, and it can be changed by cultural whim.
This is the other major reductionist move. It's an attempt to strip the law of any claim to reality. It wants to suggest that morality is arbitrary, like fashion trends, or which side of the road we drive on. But Lewis, right away, he tackles this misunderstanding that's built into the objection. He clarifies the massive difference between learning something and something being a human invention.
Right. When we are taught the rule of decent behavior, we are definitely learning it from external sources, from our culture. But learning something doesn't automatically mean it was invented. If I learn that in my country we drive on the right side of the road, that's clearly an invention, a convention. It could have just as easily been the left.
Exactly. Driving on the right is a rule, but it's an arbitrary one. It's something we chose as a group, and we could have chosen differently without any problem. But Lewis asks us to consider the other category of things we learn, things that are real truths, totally independent of our choice.
And the classic parallel he uses here is mathematics.
Yes, we all learn the multiplication table at school. It's taught to us entirely through instruction. A child who is raised completely alone on an island would be ignorant of it.
So does that mean the multiplication table is just a convention, that humans invented it, and we could have all just agreed that 2 times 2 equals 5?
Of course not. It's absurd on its face. The multiplication table describes a real truth about reality. It existed before humans ever formalized it, and it'll continue to be true whether any single society acknowledges it or not. It is discovered, not invented.
So the essential question for the moral law becomes, which of these two categories does it belong in? Is it like the arbitrary rule of the road, or is it like the fixed truth of the multiplication table?
That's the question. If it's like the rule of the road, then we can change it whenever it's convenient for us, and no version is truer or better than any other. But it's like mathematics, then we might learn it gradually, we might misunderstand parts of it, we might apply it imperfectly, but the rule itself remains fixed, real, and mandatory. And Lewis argues very strongly that it belongs in that second category.
So what's the first piece of evidence he brings to the table to put the moral law in the same class as an independent truth like math?
He asks us to just look at the evidence, to look at the consistency across different cultures and throughout history. Now, critics love to focus on the differences in moral codes, and yes, of course there are differences, but Lewis asserts that those differences are vastly exaggerated. What people so often overlook is the profound, overwhelming common ground.
So if we look at the laws of, say, the ancient Babylonians, the Chinese, the Greeks, and compare them to modern society, we find that while the specific penalties or applications of justice might differ, the core principle of justice, that you shouldn't murder, that you should honor agreements, that you should respect property, is universally present.
That underlying common law is the key. Think about things that are genuine conventions, like clothing or table manners. Those can differ entirely, to any degree you can imagine, without any logical contradiction. The way someone eats with chopsticks in China is completely different from the way someone eats with a fork and knife in England. But neither custom contradicts the other. They're just arbitrary.
But a moral principle that says it is wrong to torture an innocent person for amusement, you can't just have another culture arbitrarily invert that without fundamentally contradicting the common moral sense of humanity.
Right. That relative uniformity of these basic moral principles suggests that we're all dealing with a response to the same objective reality. Even the apparent contradictions, like tribal laws that say you should only be kind to people within your own tribe. That's not actually a rejection of the moral law. It's just an imperfect application of a universal rule, treat your neighbor justly, but with a mistaken, too narrow definition of who qualifies as your neighbor. They're affirming the rule even while misapplying its scope.
And that underlying rule remains intact and consistent, which is the hallmark of a real truth, not a shifting convention.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's turn to the second, and I would argue the most potent refutation of this whole convention theory. And that's the logical requirement that's embedded in the very idea of moral progress. We talk about moral progress all the time, but what does that word progress actually require for it to make any sense?
Progress is such a powerful word, and it's a logical minefield for the moral relativist. Because progress doesn't just mean change. If I change my shirt from a blue one to a red one, that's just a change. Progress means changing for the better. It means moving toward a more correct state.
So if all moral ideas were just conventions, just arbitrary rules made up by different groups at different times, then one set of ideas couldn't possibly be better or truer than another. They would just be different, like changing your currency from the franc to the euro.
If morality is purely conventional, there is no logical basis whatsoever to prefer, say, civilized morality over savage morality, or to argue that the 21st century's views on human rights are in any way superior to the 16th century's views.
They'd just be alternative social operating systems.
And if we really, truly believe that, we couldn't criticize the moral code of any society and that includes the worst atrocities in human history.
But we absolutely do criticize them. We use words like reformers and pioneers for historical figures, people like the abolitionists or the leaders of the civil rights movement who challenged the accepted morality of their own time. The very act of calling them a reformer implies they sought a truth that their contemporaries were missing.
The second you use the language of improvement or reform or getting nearer to the truth, you have logically admitted that there is an external fixed standard of behavior. That standard is the real morality that has to exist independent of both the reformer's new ideas and the conventional ideas of his age.
So without that external standard, the reformer isn't progressing towards anything. He's just arguing for a new arbitrary convention to replace the old arbitrary convention.
The debate wouldn't be about right and wrong. It would just be about which arbitrary system is more convenient or preferable to a certain group.
Our ability to criticize past moral systems, or even to feel guilt about our own failures, depends on the assumption of this fixed standard.
It does. When we judge the past, let's take the practice of slavery, we aren't judging it by our modern convention. We're judging it by a rule of justice that we believe ought to have applied back then, just as it applies now. This standard is the reference point. It's the reality that makes the very concept of progress logically possible.
And this brings us right to Lewis's analogy that connects moral truth to an objective, independent reality. To judge whether any idea is true, there has to be a reality that exists apart from the idea itself.
Let's use his example of the city of New York. My mental idea of New York can be judged as being truer or less true than your mental idea of New York for one reason and one reason only.
Because New York is a real place.
Because New York is a real place that exists outside of both of our minds. We can check our imperfect mental maps against the external reality of the city itself.
If New York simply meant the imaginary city that's currently in my head, then there would be no truth or falsehood involved in describing it. There would only be difference. My idea would be true for me, and your idea would be true for you.
Now, apply that same powerful logic to the moral law. If the rule of decent behavior simply meant whatever each nation happens to approve of at the moment, then there would be no truth involved. We couldn't say that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse over time. We could only say that it has changed its mind.
And since we, as a society, constantly evaluate the morality of the past and believe that humanity has, in fact, made genuine moral advances, moving away from things like public torture or summary executions or widespread injustice, that very belief requires an independent standard to measure against.
The very concept of moral improvement is the logical guillotine for the convention theory. It just cuts its head clean off. The moral law must be a real natural law like gravity or like mathematics, something that we may learn about slowly, something we apply inconsistently, and something we misunderstand frequently. But it exists outside of our subjective opinions and our cultural choices.
It's the truth about how humans ought to behave, whether we have the courage or the wisdom to fully follow it or not.
Yes. So we've now shown that the moral law is neither determined by our internal desires, nor is it invented by our social contracts. It stands as an external, real standard.
Now that we've established the reality and independence of the moral law, let's circle back to two really practical issues. First, let's revisit the danger of confusing the law with a single impulse. And second, we need to clarify how differences in moral codes are so often based on errors of fact, not errors of principle.
We really do need to reaffirm the practical danger of elevating any single internal impulse, no matter how good it seems, to the status of the absolute moral law. Lewis is very clear that doing this leads to moral ruin.
It seems a bit counterintuitive, though. How can you criticize an impulse like generalized compassion? What makes taking that as your guide so destructive?
Because the moral law isn't a single virtue. It's a complex tune. It's played with many different keys. Justice, truth, temperance, fairness, and compassion all have their part. To take just one of those instruments and make it the sole guiding star is to throw away the rest of the musical score.
So if I choose to follow compassion alone, I might have to sacrifice justice. If I choose to follow fairness alone, I might have to sacrifice mercy.
Exactly. Let's take the love of humanity again. If that is your absolute guide and you are trying to implement a system that you believe will greatly benefit the majority of people, you might find that to achieve that goal, you have to break agreements with certain individuals.
Or lie to a specific subset of people, or even imprison people without due process.
And you would justify these localized cruelties by saying it's for the sake of the greater good.
But in doing so, you're violating the moral law's demand for justice and for truthfulness.
Yes. You become treacherous and, in the end, cruel, all while believing you are being highly moral. That very action proves that the moral law is the impartial director that commands a balance between all these competing duties. It ensures that no single impulse, not even a benevolent one, is allowed to destroy the whole moral life. The law forces us to see that all our natural desires are just raw material, and none of them, on its own, has the authority to command the others.
Okay, finally, let's tackle that appearance of extreme moral differences that relativists love to point to. For instance, the historical practice of executing people who were accused of being witches. People stopped doing that, so hasn't morality just changed drastically?
This is such a crucial area where, cultural studies can get it wrong. They often conflate differences in the application of a principle with a difference in the underlying principle itself. Lewis demands we draw a very sharp line between a difference in moral principle and a difference in factual belief.
So, in the case of executing a witch, what was the underlying moral principle at play?
The principle was that heinous, destructive treason actions that cause severe harm to the community, like killing your neighbors or bringing about sickness, deserves the death penalty. That core principle that severe crimes deserve severe punishment is consistent across almost all human societies. The moral principle itself didn't change.
The factual belief changed.
Precisely. The people in the 16th century genuinely believed, as a matter of cold, hard fact, that certain individuals were selling their souls to malevolent forces, gaining supernatural powers, and then actively using them to ruin crops, murder children, and cause chaos. They viewed these accused people as, in Lewis's words, filthy quislings, who were literally destroying the community from within through supernatural means.
And I suppose if we today factually believed that our next-door neighbor had the supernatural ability to kill our child just by wishing it and that they were actively doing so, we would probably agree they should be removed from society, maybe even executed.
That is Lewis's stark assertion. We stopped executing them not because we rejected the moral rule that destructive evil should be punished. We stopped executing them because we stopped believing the fact of their existence or the fact of their alleged powers.
That makes the distinction incredibly clear. So moral advance is often just a factual advance or a scientific advance, not a change in the core moral rule.
That's it. The man who stopped setting mousetraps because he finally realizes there are no mice in his house isn't a more humane man. His factual premise has simply been updated. There's no moral advance in not punishing something you no longer think is there.
And this helps us see the consistency of the moral law. When we look at ancient societies, their moral codes are often just these universal principles like justice being applied to their specific and sometimes very inaccurate beliefs about how the world works.
The rule stays the same. Do not harm the innocent. The factual question that changes is who counts as innocent and what actions actually cause harm. The core principles of justice, fairness, and truth-telling remain remarkably consistent, which points us again to a real external standard.
So after all this, what does it all mean for us, for the listener thinking this through?
It means that the moral law successfully resists being reduced. It isn't some arbitrary rule we invented for our own convenience, nor is it merely a biological feeling that developed to help us survive. It is an independent, fixed standard that applies to humanity everywhere and always. It's a fact about reality that dictates how we ought to behave, regardless of how we want to behave at any given moment.
And the necessary conclusion of this deep dive, then, is that if this rule of decent behavior is a real, fixed, external truth, like the laws of mathematics are a real truth, then we have to seriously confront the question of its source. If the instincts are the piano keys, and our conduct is the tune, and the moral law is the sheet music directing that tune,
We are forced to ask, who wrote the sheet music? That external prescriptive standard which holds us accountable even when we defy our strongest desires and stands independent of all our collective opinions. It points compellingly toward a lawgiver, toward a mind or a will that stands behind the very structure of right and wrong.
and that's a question that demands an answer that goes far beyond mere instinct or convention. Thank you for guiding us through this foundational logic today.
It is my pleasure.
Until next time, keep thinking.